Library Association Public Programs Office. Welcome to today's webinar, An Outrage, hosting a virtual scholar-led screening and discussion. In this session, we will be talking about how your library can lead a virtual film discussion program using the documentary An Outrage and the related community discussion guide to spark a conversation. Before we start, I'd like to make a few quick notes. Today's webinar is presented by ALA's Public Programs Office with funding provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, or CARES Act, Economic Stabilization Plan. Hopefully, many of you are familiar with Programming Librarian, a website of ALA's Public Programs Office. We have a lot of program ideas and an online learning library full of free webinars like this one. A couple of notes about our virtual classroom. Only our presenters have microphone access, but you are welcome to type your questions or comments in the chat box. To send a chat message, move your cursor to the bottom of the Zoom window and click Chat. Please note that the chat defaults to sending only to all panelists. To make sure everyone can see your message, be sure to select all panelists and attendees in the drop-down box next to the To field in chat. If you have any technical issues, please use the Q&A window to communicate with ALA staff. To send a message through the Q&A feature, move your cursor to the bottom of the Zoom window and click on Q&A. Please do not put technical questions in the chat window as they could be missed there. Now I would like to introduce our speakers for this afternoon. In the first half of today's session, you will be hearing from Hannah Ayers and Lance Warren, who will be talking about the documentary, An Outrage. Hannah and Lance are Emmy-winning married documentary filmmakers working at the intersection of history and social justice. Their films include An Outrage, distributed by Canopy and Teaching Tolerance, and The Future of America's Past, airing on PBS stations nationwide. Since 2009, their work has tackled historical memory and justice through piercing personal stories of struggle and resilience. In the second portion of the webinar, you will be hearing from Jocelyn Bowling-Dixon, who will talk about how your library can host a viewing and discussion program using the documentary. Jocelyn is the director of the Newark Public Library in New Jersey. She has a wealth of experience working in large urban public libraries spanning more than 20 years. Prior to the Newark Public Library, she was the deputy director of the Prince William Public Library System in Virginia, where she supervised 11 regional, community, and neighborhood branch locations. Over the course of her career, Jocelyn has assumed many different roles in both supervisory and administrative capacities, including branch management and leading programs for children and young adults. She views the role and operations of libraries through a diverse lens, having worked in library systems in Illinois, Maryland, the District of Columbia, and Virginia. Jocelyn is an at-large counselor of the American Library Association and an active member of the Public Library Association, Urban Libraries Council, and the New Jersey Library Association. And with that, I would like to turn things over to Hannah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lainey, and thank you to ALA for this opportunity. We really appreciate the chance to connect with librarians. We are big believers that documentary films have the potential to reach a lot of people and to encourage great discussion, but they really can't do anything on their own. They really have to have advocates and allies and people like librarians who see their potential for usage and bringing people together and hopefully sparking important conversations. Before we get underway and Lance and I talk a little bit about the background to the film, about our experience touring it, and about connecting with humanities scholars, first we want to show the trailer, which is just about 30 seconds to give everyone a common point of reference for the film. So we'll go ahead and play that.
It was just so vicious.
It was a burning. It was like a stadium event.
He said, honey, it's a long, sad story.
These were ritualistic reminders of whose lives were valued and whose were not.
And someone has to pay for it. Some of these people are still alive. If they were not still alive, the case would already be solved.
So thank you indeed for having us. I want to speak a bit about the background, as Hannah said, the inspiration of the film for us. We started learning about this history several years ago through our work with teachers, history teachers. We were running an online graduate course program for history teachers, and we had historians come in and give lectures on a variety of themes in American history. More often than I think we expected, those lectures centered the history of lynching, the history of racial violence in American history. More often, I say, than we expected, because in our own education, high school and college, lynching and racial violence more broadly was not often at the center of lessons about American history. It was on the fringes. It was maybe the sidebar in the textbook, but it wasn't at the center. But the more that we learned about this, accidentally at first and then with increasing intention, the more that we learned that in fact racial violence is at the very center of what the American experience has meant for so many families, and indeed for the thousands of people who were lynched across the American South and elsewhere across the United States. We set about seeking to learn more, and one thing that we heard from the teachers who were part of the online courses that we were running, we heard that they didn't often feel that they had the tools or the training to effectively bring this history to their students. You know, we often teach about African American history in a really jerky way, which is to say that maybe we teach about the Civil War and slavery and emancipation, maybe Reconstruction, and then often there's this jump. There's this jump to the mid-20th century civil rights movement, Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and there's this sort of gap, a black hole, we might say, in between. And what fills that in many ways, is the history of lynching and racial violence across the country, and particularly in the American South. You know, the conversations that we had with teachers when they told us that they didn't feel terribly well equipped to teach this history, that's backed up by statistics. The Southern Poverty Law Center has an initiative called Teaching Tolerance. It's a teacher training program and a network of 500,000 teachers, mostly around the country, but also in American schools overseas. They have surveyed these teachers, and they have actually seen majorities of teachers responding to survey questions saying, indeed, we need more training, we need more help, more tools to effectively teach many of the hardest moments in American history, the hard history of the American experience. So we set off to see what we could learn. We looked at our own state, Virginia, and other states across the South, and we saw the very, very few visible markers of this history. And of course, that's on a landscape across the South and elsewhere in the country where there are literally hundreds of monuments to the lost cause, to the Confederacy. We also looked at films and web videos that were available to try to sketch the history of this past. And honestly, what we found was incomplete in many ways, often offensive, certainly very dated. It was not offering teachers and communities the chance to really ground themselves in the truth, the fullness of the American experience in a way that might give us a fighting chance of reckoning with it and growing from that. So as we set off in trying to make the film around the time that all these thoughts were swirling, the Equal Justice Initiative, a nonprofit legal civil rights organization based in Alabama, the Equal Justice Initiative released a report in the spring of 2015, a report that documented more lynchings than had ever previously been documented. There was quite a lot of media coverage around this, as many of you may recall, and a lot of that media coverage made much of the numbers, again, of the fact that more lynchings than had ever previously been documented had been identified by this organization. And we came to feel that there were stories to be told beyond those numbers, human stories, family stories, really American stories. And much of the documentary work that we had done already had focused on history. It's where our academic training is. And much of that work had also focused on families. You know, we all have families. It's a point of common reference. And we felt that perhaps there were ways of going and telling family stories about this hard history that would allow us a chance to understand one of the most difficult to understand things about the American past, which is that racial violence has stretched all across it.
We'll go to the next slide. The resulting film that we created in 2017 is 33 minutes long, and it features historians who really ground this history in the bigger context of how do we understand lynching, where did it happen, what is the definition. I think it's a broader definition in some ways than a lot of people assume. What forces allowed it to be such a persistent and awful presence in the South. And then we also wove those humanities scholars' comments with firsthand accounts from descendants and community activists. And we'll go to the next slide and show you where we went to produce the film. We visited 6 different states to really demonstrate the disgusting diversity of what lynching was and where it took place. And we physically went to these places in part to see what the landscape looked like and to mark the fact that there are very few visible markers to this history. And yet at each of these places, we met someone who is carrying on the memory of this history. They are refusing to let the history be forgotten, even though many people would prefer that it is. And they're refusing to let the memory of the victim go. They have been active in community groups to install a marker or to create a memorial garden. They've done research when so little has been known about some of these cases. So the film is, of course, wrenching and challenging in some ways, but we hope it also shows resilience about and the need to really carry on remembering this history and really digging up history that has been forcibly forgotten for a long time. In terms of our intended audience and the way that we distributed this film, the 33-minute running time was very intentional because we know that for a public event like you might have at your library, you might not be able to show a 90-minute film and then also expect folks to stick around for a conversation. So we wanted it to be able to fit into maybe an hour or 2-hour long event for people to have energy and time to really dive into the questions that the film asks. It's also short for classroom usage. And speaking of classrooms, this has gone out through the Southern Poverty Law Center's Teaching Tolerance program, their network. They created a very extensive guide, 50 pages, to help teachers use it in classrooms. But we recognized that was a bit chunky for use at a public event, which is why one reason why we partnered with Jocelyn to create this more kind of public program friendly guide that you'll learn more about shortly. And then we also toured it ourselves to 86 sites in 25 states, including several libraries. And that's where we really saw how the film could be used as a starting point for conversation. It certainly doesn't answer all the questions. And in fact, we wanted it to be a launching pad for, okay, how do we think about this history in our own context? How do we link this history to current events? We hope the film is a really good place to start for those kinds of conversations.
This film, of course, distressingly does remain very timely. And if we can go to the next slide, we can think about a few of the people who helped to bring the story of this film to people watching it. And indeed, first and foremost, that is the courageous cast who met us at the lynching sites where we filmed. It's also these 4 scholars, people who are esteemed in their writing on the history of Jim Crow, on African-American history writ large, on topics in American history that intersect with this film. But if you've watched the film, or when you do, you'll see, I hope, that we don't identify these 4 historians in the way that one might expect, which is to say, with the professional titles that they hold at the universities where they teach. We have identified them by the personal connections that they have to this history. We felt that was important. When we watch a documentary film, it may be a passing interest to see the university where somebody teaches and the fancy title that that person holds. But we felt that it would be much more resonant to actually tell you something about what drives the work that these scholars have done. From left to right, Mia Bay, Jonathan Holloway, Isabel Wilkerson, and Yahuru Williams each have personal realities and their own family stories and their own individual stories that drives their accomplished work in researching the history of racial violence in America. And we wanted to make sure to bring that fact to our viewers. And, you know, I'm mentioning many topics that they've written about, you know, Jim Crow, African-American history overall, and that's intentional because the history of lynching actually intersects with many different themes in the American past. Just to take one, Isabel Wilkerson notes in the film that the history of the Great Migration is in many ways a history of lynching. It is true that African Americans in the South often set out in search of jobs to support the war efforts, World Wars I and II. If you've read Isabel Wilkerson's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Warmth of Other Suns, it is, as the subtitle says, an epic story of America's Great Migration. It's also a story, as the key characters in that book set out from the South, it's a story of racial violence. It's a story of people leaving after a lynching has occurred or after a threat of imminent violence has been brought to their doorstep. That is one way in which the history of America, of the Great Migration, comes back to a history of racial violence. And then in the cities that these African-American migrants arrived in, cities that they transformed, cities that they populated, cities that they shaped for their own communities and families, cities that they assimilated into in a number of ways, cities that became the America that we know today. That again goes back to a history of racial violence. It goes back to a root from which so many people were leaving homelands that they knew to go and create a new life, new family stories elsewhere. And it comes back to this history of racial violence. It's one of so many ways that in organizing programs about American history, that we can reflect on so many of the realities that we see people demanding in the streets that we reflect and reckon with today. The fact that racial violence is not something that we can put actually in the sidebar of the textbook, not if we're being honest with ourselves. It's something that in many ways shapes the America that we know.
Go to the next slide and share just a few tips from experiences that we had touring this film and seeing how the film could really serve as a platform to bring together local scholars, local activists, and library patrons for a meaningful event. In terms of identifying a scholar, we certainly recommend that you look to your local college or university and see if there's anyone in the history department whose work might intersect with some of these themes. But you may also want to look at some broader departments, English, sociology, government, Black studies, even to a journalism or law school. And that really ties to what Lance was saying about how the themes of the film really intersect with so many different aspects of the American story. So maybe someone who researches Black writers of the early 20th century could bring a perspective about how the history of lynching is reflected in poetry or literature. And think too about what we commented on in terms of bringing someone who can offer a personal take, who has something really vested in this history. And also consider independent historians, journalists, activists who have studied some of these themes. In terms of applying a local lens, we'll go to the next slide and offer a resource that you may find helpful. It's called MonroeWorkToday.com, and it is an interactive map website created by a firm in the Bay Area. And it's really helpful because what this firm did was they built on the work of a sociologist named Monroe Work, who was at Tuskegee in the early 20th century. And he did a lot of foundational work to document the lynchings that were happening. And so they took his database, they built on it more, and they created this interactive map that allows you to zoom into your region, to your very community, and see what documented lynchings may have happened there. And you can click on one of the icons and learn about the person's name, the date, what crime they may have been accused of, and some links so you can do some more research. So that's an important place to start. And you should note perhaps to your audience that even if there is not a documented lynching on this map, it doesn't mean that there's not a history of racial violence in your community. We know that many lynchings and other forms of racial violence just were not documented. And maybe through additional research, more information would come to the fore. And when thinking about kind of who to invite into this conversation, see too if there have been any community efforts to document and to perhaps install a marker in your community, because in the past 5 years, the awareness of this history has really accelerated thanks to the work of Equal Justice Initiative and other organizations. So there may be some work already happening on the ground to install a marker, to create a memorial garden. So if there are any efforts like that underway in your community, it would clearly be a wonderful thing to involve those folks in your public program.
I want to talk about some basic particulars. If we go to the next slide, how can you access the film? Well, if you go to the film's website, which is there at the bottom middle of your screen, an-outrage.com, there's a watch link that you'll find on that site. And we recommend using Canopy. Canopy makes the film free to patrons, as you'd well know, with a library subscription. Alternatively, the film is available for a small rental fee through Vimeo on demand, and links to access the film through Canopy or Vimeo can be found on the film's website and outrage.com.
And then on the final slide of ours, we have a link is also at anoutrage.com for the community discussion guide. You'll see at the top a place to go to download the guide, which is 16 pages, and it'll download a PDF that you could print out or share electronically. And we'll turn it over to Jocelyn now to tell you much more about the guide and how you may be able to put it to use. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah and Lance. Let me just turn my camera on. Okay, so I'm going to share my experience now, and hopefully you'll get some takeaways to inform your experience should you decide to host a viewing at your library. So let me just share my experience. Like I said, I had this program. We had a viewing of An Outrage, September 2018. At Prince William Public Library System, where I was previously. And you can go to the next slide. It was billed as a 10-foot pole conversation. Now, a 10-foot pole conversation was born out of a work group that I established, one of several at that system. It was also included in equity, diversion, and inclusion work group. Shout out to Alyssa Wall and Ginger Galaney and Tony Finn, who were a big help in both presenting at the Virginia Library Association and at our library. The 10-foot pole conversation, this is where programs nested that would be what we would call controversial, or we knew it would be a topic that would touch a nerve. And so just putting it out there from the get-go, before we even have the program, it really lessened any calls. I don't think I got any, or any concerns like, what are you doing, or what are we talking about? It's getting ahead of it, front and center, that this is going to be a conversation about lynching and a viewing about lynching, and the conversation is going to get real. So we build it that way. So I think that was a big help. Working with staff, we created questions to facilitate an open-ended conversation. I will share with you some of the questions too, so you can get some ideas about them. So the questions, so after the viewing, which as Hannah and Lance said, it was a little over 30 minutes, which is perfect for a library program because it allows enough time for the discussion afterwards. Ours lasted 2 hours. Our whole event lasted about 2 hours with the viewing and discussion, but our open-ended questions included personal reflections. We talked about the legacy of lynching, memory and memorialization of lynching in America and in the county and in the state of Virginia, where I was. And then next steps, like where do we go from here based on our history, like how, and we pulled it into the present. Next slide. Some challenges and triumphs that I experienced was, and something you will want to think about too, is the community culture. What's the pulse of the community right now? Is there an appetite for discussing race? Is it uncomfortable? How will it be received? I'm not saying that to say don't do it, because it can be uncomfortable or people don't want to talk about it, but it's just something to consider for sure when you're thinking about the audience and how you want to frame how your program is going to be run, the kind of questions you're going to talk about, that kind of thing. I ran into opposition from one of our executive board members that I didn't foresee, but the Hannah and Lance talked about the 50-page curriculum guide that is based on the Teaching Tolerance platform developed by Southern Poverty Law Center. And if conservatives and Southern Poverty Law Center kind of are at odds often. And so I didn't know that. And so one of the board members was hesitant about us having this program based on that. The fear was that we were going to advance the agenda of the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is not the case at all. We didn't use the 50-page curriculum. Just thinking about library programs, as you know, it's pretty hard to use a 50-page curriculum in a 2-hour program, which is how the 16-page guide got developed, which we'll discuss later just for us, for the public library world. But I will say the 50-page curriculum, if you're at a school media library, perfect for like a lesson plan. Couldn't think of the word. Perfect for a lesson plan or a continuing lesson about it, but for our purposes. So I was able to communicate. We had our own questions, and the documenting was freestanding, and then it was clear to go, it was fine. But it's just something to think about again, and thinking about your community culture, what your board is going to say, that kind of thing. So the triumph was very well attended. We didn't have any pre-complaints or anybody writing in about, why are you doing that? And it was really well attended. We had maybe close to 20 and 30 or so people come, all ages. And for our adult program, just after the summer, I mean, it was really great because we never had done this before, and we didn't know what to expect or who was coming necessarily. We did it as an adult program, but we had teens come, we had parents come, we had same-sex couples that had biracial children, and they wanted to talk about the historical perspective and their experience living in a state like Virginia in the context of this history. So it was great to see. We saw people we usually did not see at any of our programming. So it also gave us our marching orders of being more mindful about having inclusive programming. So as I mentioned before, this led to us developing the discussion guide specifically for libraries. We had our own questions. We will share some of those. Here's a question. How has the history affected your own life or your family members' lives? So we could hear from a senior's perspective, a millennial's perspective, a teen's perspective when we asked that question. Another question was, how can we help to ensure that the history of lynching and racial violence is remembered and understood at home, at work? So it's those kind of questions that really kept the conversation going. The other key part was we had ground rules. We made sure that we established ground rules at the beginning. So it was just listening actively, participating respectfully, one person at a time talking, raise your hands. It's okay to disagree, but disagree respectfully, those kind of things. And like I said, we left the ground rules up. It never veered into us feeling like we had to remind about the ground rules, but it just set the tone for the conversation. So that was also an important piece. So after we did our presentation, after we had our event, we did a presentation, Hannah, Lance, and I, at the 2018 Virginia Library Association Conference just a few weeks later. Next slide. So the discussion guide, you can see the link here at outrage.com/community discussion guide. This has, it's 16 pages versus the 50-page curriculum guide. So this is the guide for you. It has a little background. It's short enough that you could really do a printout and have it for your attendees to read later when they leave, follow along with the questions, just give them food for thought. There's resources they can also, if they want to explore the topic further, all those things are in there. And so at the Virginia Library Association conference, we actually live edited this. So we had librarians watch the film, and then we broke up into breakout groups and came up with the questions that, again, went back to maybe 4 different areas, such as personal reflections. How do you tie in the legacy of lynching? How do you discuss it at a local level, what's going on? How do you tie it to today? The memory and memorialization piece. And then next steps. So what do we do with this history? How do we move forward with this? And so those type of questions are in the guide that's shown here, and the link is there too. Next page. All right, just a quick picture. Speaking of that presentation at the Library Association, we were just saying before we went out, we wish we would have taken more pictures of how it all went down, because it was really wonderful to see it in action. And so that's Hannah and Lance together doing the presentation at September 27th Virginia Library Association Conference. I believe that one was in Norfolk. Next slide. Okay, so this is the library discussion guide. Once again, the link is here. And you will see it in the slides afterwards too. So it's, like I said, it's printable, it's short enough to print and share, and it'll give you, not that you can't make it your own, but it'll guide your conversation nicely and give you pause for reflection. The other thing was, it's just such a powerful film that it kind of knocks you, like it's just like an eerie quiet afterwards as you're digesting it. So the questions really help with the digestion and analyzing of what we just saw after you watch it. Next slide. The other piece I would suggest, just to take it further, Hannah and Lance touched upon this, is finding a scholar to underpin your event. This is a perfect time to do that also. That's one blessing, one silver lining of this pandemic era is often you can get speakers because they don't have to come in. They might have the availability they hadn't had before, where you can have them underpin your discussion with their background in Black studies and history and racial relations and that sort of thing. This is a great link. If you're looking for something like that, you're not sure where to start, just contact your state humanities council. And this link here from NEH has scholar recommendations that might be helpful when you plan your programming. And then again, contact your local academic institutions. They may be searching for ways to continue their work that they have to do in terms of presenting and partnering with organizations and that sort of thing. So that's a way, another step you can take to take it to the next level. And I wish we had thought of that and had taken that step as well. Next slide. All right, and we talked about this, but just to review, of course, you use online meeting platforms such as Zoom as GoToMeeting. One thing that's great about this, it's a perfect way to segue the program into a virtual program. It's one of those that will sit nicely that way, that translate nicely into a virtual program. So I definitely recommend those two. The documentary, as mentioned before, you can stream it through Canopy. Most libraries have Canopy. If you don't, Vimeo is available. There's not many programs you can do for about $2.99. So it's a great bargain for a very impactful program. Also work with the scholars to engage via the chat while watching the film together. If people I don't know, you might be so mesmerized that, again, you have like a silence as they're absorbing it, but the chat feature is a great place for the scholar to interact even before the discussion starts after the viewing. And then just be sure to enable the microphones and video for a live discussion following the film. Next slide. All right, so our contact information is there. This concludes our presentation. Thanks so much. I enjoyed working with Lance and Hannah in coming up with the questions and the discussion guide and presenting at the conference and at our library. And I suggest it for any library program, especially in these times as we're grappling with our racial past and our future. So thank you.